Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for attending this webinar on have you considered a marketing or a PR apprenticeship? Apprenticeship landscape has changed hugely, and so what I'm going to do in this webinar is cover off some of the areas that we know from our conversations with companies and HR managers and marketing managers, things that we know are confusing them about the new apprenticeship landscape. But as Mark said, please do ask questions as you go through. Mark will collate those and I will take questions at the end. So to explain, I am Kiran Kapoor. I'm the CEO, as Mark said, of the Cambridge Marketing College, and my contact details have just come up on the screen for you. The college has been around for 28 years now, and all that time we've been teaching marketing for 28 years, and we've been teaching PR for about 25 years. So we've come at this with a very strong background in teaching marketing qualifications and PR qualifications, and then have added the apprenticeships onto what we currently offer. So we have a slightly different view in the marketplace in that we understand why people can find this confusing, and we also understand what it is that people want to get out of apprenticeships at the end. So forgive me for a little bit of light humour. I was a bit worried that someone in the office didn't actually know who was down the bottom. That is, on the bottom right is Luke Skywalker, the young Jedi apprentice from Star Wars, and obviously on the top you've got the Sorcerer's Apprentice. Apprentices have changed hugely. Originally, you would probably think of apprentices as being things like car mechanics or hairdressers, or and sort of trades. The government then decided that they wanted to move away from that and introduce what they called professional apprentices, and that's very much what we're going to be looking at. So very briefly, what a levy payer is a company with an annual salary bill of £3 million, and that if you have an annual salary bill of that, you are required to pay into what is called the levy pot, which is to fund apprenticeships. Some companies view this as a tax, but you are required to put a certain amount of money aside that funds apprenticeships. If you don't use that pot, it will be transferred to other companies, smaller companies, the non-levy payers, sometime this year. But and we will come on to that in a minute. So if you're in a position where you're not sure, that's how you know. It's based very much on your salary bill. Okay. So, oops, sorry, I've gone too far. So the old apprenticeships were on frameworks, and in deference to those that I know are reasonably up to speed with this, I will speed through some of these slides. The last intake on the old apprentice frameworks is at the end of July next year. What we now have are apprenticeship standards, and these were set by employers groups called trailblazer groups, and you can actually see, when we look at the standards, you can see who was on the trailblazer groups and set the standards up. The last set of figures that the Institute of Apprenticeships released was in October, but at that stage they'd approved 358 standards, and they'd got a further 219 in development. I know a few more have been approved there, but it's still not going to be massively different from that figure, because if it was a lot bigger, they'd have done a press release to tell us. So, in order to find an apprenticeship standard, you would go to the Institute for Apprenticeships website, which I'll give you the URL in a moment, and you can select different types of apprenticeships. This one I've pulled up in front of us is the Public Relations Assistant Apprenticeship, and you will see that there's a level. The level of the apprenticeship, it gives you the attainment, the academic attainment level. So a level 2 is equivalent to a GCSE. A level 3 is equivalent to an A-level. This is a level 4, which is equivalent to a first year of a degree or a foundation degree. A level 5 is a sort of second year of a degree. A level 6 is a final degree, a BA or an MSc honours level. a Bachelor's of Arts or a Bachelor's of Science level, and a level 7 would be a master's level. And there are now apprenticeships that take in levels 4, 5, 6, and 7. That was the big change that came in with the standards. You also have a duration. That is the minimum amount of time the apprentice can stay on the apprenticeship, and it's usually 12 months and 2 days. Some of the apprenticeships, like a degree apprenticeship, may be up to 36 months. Oops, sorry, that's the wrong way around. And there's also a code which gives you the name, the code of the standard. And you'll see underneath there is a funding level. That is the maximum amount of money that you can, that the government sees this apprenticeship should be worth. And therefore, if you're a levy payer, that's the maximum amount you can take out of your levy pot for that apprenticeship. And that's the Institute of Apprenticeships URL, and you can go there for all the apprenticeship standards. Obviously that particular one gives you the public relations assistant, but if you go back to the basic standards, it will give you all the standards that are available. Copies of the slides will be available at the end. So I then clicked through to see what is covered in a standard. And I just wanted to give you a brief overview because this applies to all the apprenticeship standards. So here it gives you a typical duration, 12 to 18 months. Interestingly enough, and I think what HR managers often find useful is it does give you the typical job titles that the apprenticeship will cover. They're not usually particularly surprising, but it does give you an idea of where the apprenticeship is going to fit. And under each apprenticeship, the standard sets the syllabus, and it's divided between knowledge, skills, and behaviours. And the easiest way to explain that is to look at these individually. So for the PR and communications assistant, we have the knowledge that is required. So here in the standard are laid out the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 elements of knowledge. So you'll be looking, to begin with, you're looking at current affairs, the PR industry, media and marketing. Now note the words there, and that's why I picked the top one, including sector-specific insights. This is really important. It's one of the things we often find when we are talking to companies, is they say, how much can you tailor the apprenticeship to what we do? And the answer is probably more than you think you can. So the apprenticeship overall must cover what's set out in the standard, but all the standards allow you to do a certain amount of sector-specific items. So if you are working for, I inducted someone who worked for a manufacturing company last week. Obviously, they're only interested in heavy manufacturing and the type and the sectors that they're involved in, and that's fine. We can relate the current affairs and the media and the marketing very much to their area. Obviously, it's good for apprentices to see a wider view, because what they tend to see is very much what happens in their company, and it's great if they get an overview of the world of the PR industry. But from a company perspective, obviously you want to know that they are learning things that are relevant to you, rather than if you're working in pharmaceuticals, you don't necessarily want your apprentices to know how to do PR for baked beans. That's the knowledge. Then the next set is the skills, and this is a description of what the skills are that the apprentice should build. And these tend to be slightly more woolly than the direct. So you've got using IT effectively, as opposed to, so it's not something we can necessarily test, but it's something that will be very useful. Building effective relationships. Assisting campaigns. Now, the building effective relationships, obviously for PR, is really important, and for marketing, but it's something we often find when we're talking to the apprenticeship managers. They're saying, you know, this is something that we want the apprentices to build on, to learn their interpersonal skills. Very important in marketing PR, where so much of what we do involves influencing other people. So we've got specific under here, distributing content, and most importantly, in the bit everybody hates doing, which is the evaluating results. I've not met a single marketing or PR person that actually enjoys evaluating results, but it's a very important part of the work. And then last of all, and I think from the college's perspective, having taught marketing and PR for so long, the behaviours is probably the side that we are finding the most interesting to teach, because it isn't something that we normally do. It isn't something, if you took a CIM qualification or a CIPR qualification, you wouldn't be tested on the behaviour side. But I can see it's a really important part of being an effective worker. So here you've got some behaviours. So we've got specifically proactively updating your colleagues on progress, flagging time slippages. Now, how useful is all of this? Managing your line manager's expectations. So we're asking at this level, it's a fairly junior PR role, to learn how to manage upwards. Being aware of the pressures of other members of the team, being enthusiastic and having a can-do attitude. How often do we put that in a job description? But this is actually something that the apprentice will be measured on and will be asked about. A commitment to getting the job done. Punctuality, reliability, taking personal responsibility. And then probably the ones you'd more expect, things like being creative, so being creative in the development of new ideas and overcoming challenges. And as part of completing the apprenticeship successfully, and we'll look at the assessment in a moment, you have to be able to prove that you have moved on in these behaviours. So it's very much taken from discussions with the line managers, with the mentors and with the tutors to prove that, and obviously with the apprentice, to prove that the apprentice has actually demonstrated this. And if they don't, they will not pass the apprenticeship. And I think this is the element that the behaviour side, I think, is one of the things that makes this such a valuable thing to do. So how does it work? Well, first of all, it must be a real job. You can't just invent something. The apprentice has to be doing a real day-to-day job. The employer must allow 20% of time to do off-the-job training. That is equivalent of 1 day a week. Now, again, that's less onerous than I think many of the employers I talk to realise, because for a start, it doesn't have to be a full day. It doesn't have to be every Friday you lose the apprentice. In fact, I would strongly advise that you don't do that. If you are doing as ours is, which is an online blended approach, it is much better to do 2 hours a day in set time slots than it is to try and do a full day, because we all know what happens. You say, I've got a full day to study, oh, I'll just get on with my emails. The employer recruits or internally identifies the apprentice. It's not something the training provider does. So you need to identify someone on the real job who you want to take this apprenticeship. The employer then selects the training provider. Training providers can be found when you go to the Institute of Apprenticeships and look for the standards. On the right-hand side of the screen, there is you can click on a list of training providers that support that standard. After that, it gets quite simple from the employer's perspective, because you agree the contract, including the length of time and the contract amount. And then you hand it over to the training provider, who will be in charge of doing the training, keeping track of the apprentice, and keeping the employer up to speed with how the apprenticeship is getting on. If your training provider is not providing you with regular feedback, you need to be querying it, because it's one of your roles as the employer to know what is going on with the apprentices. And it is the role of the training provider to make certain that they are up to speed with the apprentice at all times. Who can be an apprentice? Absolutely anybody. It's moved on from the idea that apprentices were always very young. Apprentices can be any age. I've actually inducted somebody who is in her mid-50s. And is thoroughly looking forward to, and I think is going to be a very successful apprentice. So we need to remove the mental barriers. I'm personally very interested in the idea of apprentices being a way back to employment for people that have taken a career break, for example. And I think it's, again, because you get the behaviour side, which can be very helpful if you've had a career break and perhaps you've lost a bit of confidence, which often happens with a career break. How do I find an apprentice? There is plenty of support. I thought I'd give you the government campaign leaflet. So there's hireanapprentice.campaign.gov.uk or #hireanapprentice. This is through the Institute of Apprenticeships website. The training provider that you select can help you hire an apprentice by advertising the post for you on this Hire an Apprentice website. That is all the training provider can do. But if you want to put an advert onto the Hire an Apprentice, you do that through the training provider. You can't do that directly as an employer. Okay, so I said if you clicked on the right-hand side, so back into that Institute of Apprentices website, and when the standards, I click through, this is on the right-hand side. So what it tells me is that the apprenticeship at the top there has been approved for delivery. As I said, there are a lot of standards that haven't yet been approved, and the date that it was approved, and the maximum funding, and the duration. That was, I said, about the employers that were involved. So here we've got everyone from British Airways to the University of Westminster. And then underneath, you can print out the full details of the occupational standard, which is what I took the knowledge, skills and behaviours from. And ultimately, you can also find out the assessment plan. And this is the point we're going to go on to, how apprentices are assessed. So we come to the end of an apprentice. You've finished the typical duration of 12 months, possibly 15 months for your apprenticeship. If it was a marketing manager's one, it would be 2 years. And you are now ready to take an assessment. This has to be approved with the employer, the training provider and the apprentice, to say that the apprentice is now ready to go through what the government has beautifully called the gateway. You go through that gateway and you are then into the assessment period. The assessment is not carried out by the employer or the training provider. It is carried out by a separate endpoint assessment organisation. The assessment that you have to do is laid down in the standard, and the slide I gave you actually said at the bottom that you could print out the assessment. So typically, before I get to that, typically the assessment will include something like a short multiple choice test, which allows the endpoint assessor to see how well the person understands the knowledge. And for all the marketing and the PR ones, with the exception of digital marketing, which I'll come on to, so it's slightly different, you have to do a short multiple choice test, then you have to write a report of a varying length depending on which standard you're doing. And this report would be on a project that you have worked on. You put together, to support that, a series of items, up to 10 items, that are things that you've worked on that project and things that you're proud of. That report is written and it is submitted to the endpoint assessment organisation. The endpoint assessor will then come back and the apprentice has to do a presentation, usually between 10 or 15 minutes. It's laid down in standard exactly how long the presentation has to be. And then the assessor will ask questions. And the questions can be on the presentation and the project, and also on any part of the apprenticeship. And the length of time they are allowed to ask questions is also laid down in the standard. For the marketing manager one, it's nearly 40 minutes, which is quite a long time for an apprentice to be explaining what they're doing. Endpoint assessments are graded. They are graded distinction, merit, pass, and fail. If you fail, you are allowed to retake, and again, there are set times that you can retake within the endpoint assessment period. And you will normally find that the training provider has to pay for the for any resits. That's a bit of an incentive for a training provider to make certain that the apprentice is actually ready. And at the end of it, the apprentice does actually get a sort of qualification, because the apprenticeship is itself. You can say, I passed the level 4 marketing executive apprenticeship. So here is a summary, and again, I've stuck with the public relations one just to keep it consistent as we went through. And so this is a summary. I've actually taken this from the endpoint assessment details. So you have a typical program which covers the various things. Then you have the endpoint assessment gateway, which is the point you decide that you're ready to go through and you agree what the project is going to be. And here, the endpoint assessment, there is a maximum of 14 weeks. So we don't want to trigger this point and then discover the apprentice is going on a 3-week holiday. So in that time, they will write the report, take the knowledge test, and be graded. And some of the apprenticeships you can then go on to professional recognition. So, but essentially, you need to look at when you're setting up an apprenticeship, you've got the on-programme time, and then you've got the endpoint assessment time. So if you're setting up a fixed contract for an apprentice, that's the length of time that you need to give them. Well, obviously, I'm going to do a little bit about finding a training provider. So your training provider must be approved by the Education and Skills Funding Agency, known as the ESFA. And in order to prove that, they need to be listed on ROTAP, which is the Register of Training Providers. Your training provider is your partner in this. They should be working with you. And as I said earlier, you can find the details of suitable training providers under each standard. So here are the various marketing and PR apprenticeships. I'm going to do a very quick overview of them, and then we will be ready to take some questions. So let's start with the digital marketer. Now, the digital marketer one is the most long-standing of the 4 apprenticeships that you've got in front of you. It was set up over nearly 18 months ago, and there are now 50 people that have actually gone through and passed it, which is for digital marketing is sufficient. Now, one of the things about the digital marketing is the funding band was 12,000 and has now been reduced to 11,000, and the ESFA is looking at funding bands across all the apprenticeships. The difference between the digital one and the others is that it actually includes an element of taking qualifications. So for the digital, you have to have a certain amount of technical knowledge, and this is assessed through a combination of knowledge modules and professional qualifications, one of which is the Chartered Institute of Marketing's Digital Award in Digital Marketing. Others are things like Google Squared or Google Analytics, so that you come out from that one with an element of a qualification in things like the Digital Marketing Award and also with the apprenticeship. The others very much work the same way as the PR assistant one did, where you come out with knowledge, skills, behaviours, but no actual additional qualification. I'm not going to go, I've just been given a note to say this is getting complicated, so I will come back to those individually as people ask me questions on them. The last thing I want to finish off with is funding. Levy paying employers, as I talked about, your payroll was over 3 million, you've been paying into a levy pot, you've drawn down for this pot for each apprenticeship. If you don't lose it within 24 months, you do lose it because it will go off to smaller companies. Non-levy payers, you can still have apprenticeships, but they will be on frameworks, not standards. In order to get an apprenticeship on the new standards, and all of the marketing and PR ones are standards, not frameworks, you need to wait until the government opens up the apprentice training budget to non-levy paying employers. And originally that was going to happen in the next tax year, which is April 2019, but that's now been delayed. It will be sometime this year. What the government suddenly decided was they didn't want one date when all non-levy paying employers, in other words, everybody who's a smaller company, would at one hit be able to come into the marketplace and demand apprenticeships. So they've decided they're going to phase it, but they haven't decided how. And for that, the government, you as an employer, will pay 10% of the cost of the apprenticeship, and the government will top you up by 90%. Once that actually comes in, believe me, it will be all over the news, and you'll be approached by training providers right, left and centre. But at the moment, we're waiting for the government to confirm.